My insides were ice, and my skin was on fire. The pain of the ritual ripped through my body and felt like my blood had been replaced by a million tiny white-hot needles that screamed through my veins and tore my insides to ribbons of bloody viscera. My vision was blurred around the edges, and all I could see was her face. Green eyes, red lips, and white skin, framed by hair so red that when the sunlight caught it, her head looked as if it was wreathed in swirling flames. "Just a little bit longer," she said. I gritted my teeth and nodded. I could feel the sweat pouring down my face. After a moment, she slid the dagger from my heart, and I gasped. A dark, mist-like shadow drifted from the wound, melting in the slanting rays of sunlight that came in through the window. "Okay, now it's my turn," she said. I picked up the knife and waited as she murmured the old words under her breath, eyes closed. She finished, and I shoved the knife into her heart. She groaned and lurched forward, fiery hair falling over her face, sticking to it with the sweat that had already drenched down her forehead. Thin wisps of white smoke drifted up from the surface of her skin. I turned the hourglass over and I waited, watching the sand trickle grain by grain into the mounting pile at the bottom. We both knew this ritual would result in our deaths, yet we both knew that it was the only way to survive. It started with an addiction. No, that's not right. It's never an addiction at first. At first, it's only harmless fun. At least, we thought it was harmless then. By the time we found out what it really was, it was far too late for redemption, and the only thing left was to follow along the path of destruction that had been laid before us while we willingly shut our eyes. Anna and I are vampires. We were part of a coven in New York City that consisted of 7 other members, all of them much older and more powerful than us. At just barely over 200 years old, Anna and I were like children among gods. There was Sven and Helene, who had met sometime in the Dark Ages, and Boris and Celeste, who had met in the early 200s. The leader of the coven was Elric. Nobody knew how old he was, and it was Elric who first brought us the drug. Because he was our leader, we had no choice but to accept his gift. That is the way in vampiric society. It's a consequence of our immortality. For humans, no matter how powerful a ruler is in life, he eventually dies, and those under his tyranny are sometimes allowed a brief respite before they fall under the rule of another tyrant. With vampires, it's somewhat different. Vampires grow powerful with age, and the longer they live, the fewer there are who can challenge them. New ideas cannot take root because the protectors of the old never die to make way for the next generation. So when Elric brought us the drug, we didn't ask where it had come from. Even a hint of questioning the leader's judgment could result in death. And besides, it seemed perfectly ordinary at first. Just normal human blood. It looked the same, smelled the same, hell, it even tasted the same. Yet as soon as the first drop ascended through the ducts in my fangs, I knew it was something very different. My heart began to pound against the cage of my chest like a rabid animal. It was not the pounding of anxiety, but the pounding of immeasurable excitement, the drumbeat of mania wildly erratic in my chest, ears, and throat. My joints loosened and grew liquid, and the ambient pain of my body vanished into a spreading warmth that turned my muscles into slack rubber bands. I had never felt this good before, not even when I was still human, and drugs of the mind could still exert their effects on me. Elric didn't partake the first time. He merely watched the 6 of us as we sank down in our chairs, bodies pleasantly slack, but minds alert, buzzing like electric wires. We went on that way for a while, with Elric bringing us the blood and sometimes partaking with us, but usually not. We never asked where it came from. It started with us not having the courage to risk Elric's wrath, but as the drug sank its claws deeper and deeper into us, the more we came to simply not care about its origins. That must have been what Elric was waiting for, because when we finally didn't care at all, when the drug had complete power over us, Elric revealed the source. He led us to the poor district of town. None of us had been here for a long while. It's prime hunting grounds for young vampires who desire easy prey, but the people on this side of the town can't afford to eat well, and their blood is bitter and moves through the veins like sludge. Yet here we were, and Elric seemed positively delighted by the place. The rundown buildings with bars on the windows, the deserted streets that were pockmarked with potholes, even the smell of desperation filled the air. All seemed to hold a powerful charm over him. He stopped at an old warehouse with wooden planks nailed to the windows and rust spots covering its aluminum walls like leprous sores. He approached a heavy roll-up door and banged on it. It opened. There was no need to ask who it was. Elric's scent was known to every vampire within 1,000 miles. We followed him into the building. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with the earthy scent of rot, intermingled with metallic smell of blood. A sense of foreboding lay heavy on us. It felt to me as if I was walking into the charnel pit of a great beast's stomach. Through the darkness, I could make out a wooden hatch in the floor, and as we approached it, I heard sounds coming from below. Moaning, screaming, crying, the sounds of human suffering. Elric opened the hatch and motioned for us to go inside while he held up the door. We did as we were bid. What I saw inside that room will forever be seared into my synapses until the day it is mercifully washed away by my death. The room, repugnant to all 5 senses. It was filled with dozens of torture devices on which naked humans were bound, screaming as their bodies were assaulted. Some of the devices were medieval and some were modern inventions. The humans inside were stretched on racks, tied to posts and whipped with cat's paws, strapped to chairs and shocked with cattle prods, and many other tortures old and new that I just won't say out loud. Their cries of agony mingled together into a single sound that rippled through my insides, making them squirm with revulsion. Elric had to raise his voice over the pitiful sound. Adrenaline and endogenous opioids mostly, enkephalins, endorphins. The pain releases them into the bloodstream, and then we drain them. Go on and try. It's better fresh. Boris and Celeste went ahead with no hesitation. Sven and Helene shot each other an uneasy glance, but they too stepped forward to feed. Only Anna and I remained behind, rooted to the spot by the horror of what we were seeing. Eric turned to us expectantly. Well, it was Anna who spoke for the both of us. This is evil, Elric. We don't want any part of it. Elric turned to me. His eyes searched my face. Is this how you feel too? I silently nodded in assent. Elric's face grew hard, and when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, and even. If that is how you feel, then so be it. But this is how I am going to run my coven. And if you want no part of it, then I will no longer consider you a part of this brotherhood. You are still young and idealistic. I can understand that. So, I will give you 3 days to think it over before I kill you. You may leave. Elric didn't wait for us to reply. He simply turned his back and went to feed, and after another moment, Anna and I turned the other way and walked out of the building. It was Anna's idea. Of the two of us, she was always the clever one. We both knew that 3 days was not enough time to complete our task, but our actions were quickened by the desperate knowledge that no other options lay before us. As soon as the plan was formed, We rented a car under a fake name and drove to Ohio. We didn't fly, it would have been too easy to track us that way, and we didn't want to give Elric and the others any hint of what we were up to. We rolled into Cleveland on a sunny day. White, feathery clouds drifted lazily through the sky. It felt strange to be in such a dire situation on such a beautiful day, but I supposed it couldn't be helped. We checked into a hotel with cash and then waited for night to fall. It wasn't difficult for us to steal what we needed. The facility had been guarded, of course, but the shadows were our ally. The shadows run through the veins of vampires in place of blood, and we can melt into them if needed, dissolving through spaces through which solid beings cannot pass. Once we had obtained what we needed, we packed it carefully away and drove back to New York City. This was going to be much harder. There was no chance of us fighting it out. We had to pretend to submit. We came upon the torture warehouse near midnight. The moon was a yellow sliver in the sky, like a pus-ridden wound in inky black flesh. Long shadows stretched across the building, grown darker and more sinister with the horrible knowledge of what was inside. We hid the syringes underneath our coats, several of them taped to our wrists, ready to be loosed at the correct moment. We knocked on the door and it rolled open. Helene was the one who had answered. His eyes were wide and frantic, and black blood dribbled down his chin in two narrow streams. "So you've come to your senses. Good, come in and partake." We followed him into the building and down the wooden hatch that opened into the yawning mouth of mortal hell. The rest of the coven was inside, feeding. They stooped over prostrate figures, blood dribbling down their chins and necks, and their victims moaned weakly below them. Elric stood in the corner and watched. He smiled at us as we entered, but it wasn't a warm smile. "I am glad you have returned to the fold. For you, I've saved the best." He gestured towards a young woman who lay bound naked to a bed. Her body was covered with scars, knife marks, and burn circles, and her fingers had all been broken. We slowly approached the woman. Anna gestured for me to feed first, and I did. She fed after me, and I covered her with my body as she emptied the syringe of prion-infected blood into the woman's neck. The woman hardly seemed to notice, and the rest of the coven took no notice at all. They were all either feeding, or else they lay stretched out on the floor in drug-induced bliss. Elric clapped his hands. "Welcome back to the Brotherhood," he exclaimed warmly. He bent down and drained the rest of the woman's lifeblood away. We watched with apprehension, waiting for him to realize our trick. But he didn't. He simply stretched out like a cat, letting a sigh of pleasure escape his blood-stained lips. With Elric's lapse in vigilance, it was easy to poison the rest of the victims. And then we sat in the corner and watched. Sven was the first to feel it. He was feeding when it hit him, and he suddenly staggered back from the naked man strapped to the high-backed wooden chair. He began tottering drunkenly from side to side, swatting around at the air as if he were batting away insects. Helene rushed towards him, but she tripped and fell on the way, and she couldn't push herself up back off the ground. A puddle of blood formed where her slack mouth lay on the dirt floor. Sven's eyes were lost and scared, and then blood leaked out of them like tears, and he sank like a heap to the floor. Boris and Celeste had been lying in the corner in a drug-induced haze of pleasure. They never rose again. The only one who didn't die right away was Elric. His mouth frothed with blood and his eyes were red, and cords stood out on his neck as he fought what he knew was coming. "You'll die for this," he said, spilling a bubbly mix of spit and blood down his chin as he spoke. "I know," I said, "but you'll die first." And he did. We had no choice but to put the poisoned humans out of their misery, and after that we fled far away and hid ourselves. we performed the ritual that would be both our death and our salvation. Ancient words to banish undeath, and the silver dagger held inside the heart until the scourge of evil is burnt away. Only then were we rid of our vampirism and the smell of undeath that would allow the other covens to hunt us down and destroy us for what we had done. Now we were all but invisible to them, our scents buried underneath the intermingled smell of 7 billion other people. I know what we did was right, yet the gruesome deaths of our coven still feature often in my dreams, and I still have nightmares, waking and sleeping, about the looks of relief that washed over the faces of the tortured humans as we put them to death. But out of everything that happened, the thing that haunts me the most is this. Until Anna had spoken up in protest for the both of us, I was still going to feed.